Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart Teicher. Before we get started on today's episode, I want you to know that I published a book. It's about one of the most famous good lawyers gone bad, F. Lee Bailey. It's the incredible story about the ascent and descent of one of the most famous lawyers in history, and it's called The Crash and Burn of a Super Lawyer. It's all about the career of F. Lee Bailey. You can find it on Amazon. It's both an ebook and in print. It's called The Crash and Burn of a Super Lawyer. I hope you enjoy it. Today's episode is the amazing story about the crash and burn of a lawyer and politician. If you like the story and you enjoy the podcast, please go rate it on your podcast platform of choice. And if you want to leave a review, that would be great too. Thank you to all of you who've done so already. I read all of those reviews, and I really appreciate you taking out the time to do so. So enjoy today's episode, The Senator's Secret. James looked out over the horizon, listening. He could hear it coming in the distance, and it was massive. It was also expected. There were the rumbling of wheels carrying heavy guns over dirt roads, the clanging and jingling noise made by men in uniform with rifles slung over their shoulders or sabers on their hips. And then there were the footsteps. Thousands of them, all belonging to the men who were hooting and hollering as they tread closer and closer towards James. James was a farmer in Georgia, and he had a pretty good life up to that moment. He grew crops and raised livestock, and he had cattle and farmland and slaves, which meant that he had a pretty decent life by the standards of the day. Of course, those standards were somewhat low, given that a civil war had been raging for years. But the good graces James had enjoyed up to that point were about to be in jeopardy, because it was November of 1864, and James was about to be overrun by the advancing forces of Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. The United States Civil War had been dragging on for years, and the North's General Sherman wanted to bring the disastrous campaign to a close. So he devised a plan that he hoped would bring about the end of the war. Sherman had just conquered the city of Atlanta. He decided that it was now time to advance towards the shoreline and seize the city of Savannah, Georgia. But the advance toward the southeast would not simply be a military campaign. It would be part military warfare and part psychological warfare. Sherman planned to wreak havoc along the way from Atlanta to Savannah to prove to the Confederate population that its government could not protect the people from invaders. Sherman wanted the Southern civilians to see with their own eyes that further resistance by the South was futile. So Sherman took his 60,000 men. He divided those forces and directed each column to make a devastating march to the sea. The massive force set out from Atlanta, heading toward Savannah, and along the way the forces terrorized everyone they encountered. They destroyed factories, stole supplies from storehouses, and decimated crops. People in the South heard that Sherman was coming, but there was no way of knowing the exact path he'd take from Atlanta to Savannah. But at the moment James heard those advancing troops in the distance, he realized that Sherman had chosen the route that ran through his hometown of Griswoldsville, Georgia. Like all of the other Southern landowners who found themselves in the path of Sherman's forces, everything that James had was looted or destroyed. James was just a stepping stone on Sherman's march to the sea, and the campaign was a successful one. General Sherman completed his march to the sea soon after he ran through James' property. On December 22, 1864, General Sherman telegraphed President Lincoln and told him that he had a Christmas present for the leader. Savannah, he explained, had fallen. Although his successful march to the sea was over, General William Tecumseh Sherman was not finished inflicting pain on the mutinous Southerners. A month after capturing Savannah, Sherman lobbied President Lincoln to permit Sherman to decree a military order that would impose what might be the ultimate insult to Southern landowners. Sherman wanted to take away their land, and Lincoln agreed. On January 16, 1865, Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which confiscated 400,000 acres of land in an area that went from Charleston, South Carolina, all the way down to Florida. The property was taken from the Southern landowners and given to newly freed black slaves in 40-acre segments. It would forever be known as the reparations package called 40 Acres and a Mule. But the win for freed slaves would be short-lived. President Lincoln would soon be assassinated, and after the war was over, a new president would be elected. Unfortunately, Andrew Johnson was a bit of a segregationist, and he almost immediately overturned Sherman's directive. It wasn't too difficult, given that it was a military order, and Johnson, as the new commander-in-chief, could rescind the order as easily as Lincoln approved it. Ultimately, most of the land was returned to the original Southern owners. Most, but not all. At least one parcel that was granted to black slaves was retained, a parcel in Warsaw, North Carolina, a parcel that is now owned by a woman named Renee Miller. Renee Miller lives on a tract of land that was granted to her great-great-grandparents after the Civil War. Her family is buried in a cemetery nearby, and Renee often walks down to that cemetery to pay her respects. It's a tight-knit Southern community where, over the years, people made their living growing tobacco and corn. And many of those family farms were also engaged in one of the most popular agribusinesses in the region: pigs. Raising pigs was big business in North Carolina. For decades, family farms in the state were a major player in our country's pork production, and it made a good living for people like Renee Miller's family. And then, one day, it all went to shit. Literally. The area where Renee Miller lived soon began to stink like pig shit. The stench was everywhere, and it was absolutely intolerable. But why? Pig farming had gone on for generations in the area. Well, in the 1980s, the pig industry in North Carolina changed drastically. And one of the guys you can blame for that is Locke Faircloth. Locke Faircloth may have had a typically Scottish first name, but he was a typically Southern guy. He looked like an old-school Southerner, too. He looked old and weathered. Not bad, just sort of plain old mannish. He wore conservative suits, had a little belly above his belt line, and his gray hair was receding. But inside the pants pocket of his average suits was a far larger than normal wallet stuffed with a whole lot of cash. Locke made a ton of money as a cotton farmer in North Carolina and then expanded into other businesses like car franchises. But the business that put Locke Faircloth on the map was, you guessed it, pig farming. Locke Faircloth, however, did not run a family farm. In fact, he pioneered a move away from the family farm business model. Faircloth was one of the pork entrepreneurs who championed a new method of pig farming called contract farming. Contract farming is an arrangement where large corporations either bought family farms or merged with them through contract, where the company provided pigs in exchange for land and waste management services. It was a practice that people like Locke Faircloth embraced because it allowed his business to grow exponentially. For Faircloth, it worked like a charm. Eventually, he had 40 different hog operations, and he grew his farms to have anywhere from 30,000 to 140,000 hogs, depending on whose count you believe. It wasn't long before pig farming in North Carolina changed permanently. Corporate hog producers began replacing independent family-owned farms. Operators like Locke Faircloth became the norm. In his case, he became the largest independent pork producer for the industrial giant Smithfield Farms. His operation got so big that people started to call him Boss Hog. I don't think that was related to the character on the TV show Dukes of Hazzard from the 1980s, but you never know. Locke Faircloth didn't just transform the industry, he changed the community as well. The pig farming business grew in the state so much that in the year 2000, that area of North Carolina had 9.3 million pigs. 9.3 million! And there is one thing that comes with millions of pigs: millions of pounds of feces. And that's what brought the smell to North Carolina. The smell of pig feces got so bad that people like Renee Miller couldn't even leave their homes. Renee complained that every time she walked outside, her eyes watered and her throat burned, and it did not let up. People couldn't have barbecues, their kids couldn't play in the yard, nothing. It was like being on home confinement. People might have hated the stink that Faircloth's industrial farming caused in North Carolina, but they didn't hate the man. In fact, they liked him so much that they elected him to Congress. Locke Faircloth became the state's junior senator in 1992. Faircloth must have believed that his first term in Congress would be the start of a long career in D.C. politics. And when it was time for him to run for re-election in 1998, Faircloth must have thought that the campaign would be a cakewalk. I mean, he had to think that when he considered his challengers bona fides. There basically weren't any. The guy who would challenge Locke Faircloth for his Senate seat had absolutely no political experience whatsoever. He'd never held a single political office. But political experience was not the asset that his challenger would rely upon in his bid to unseat Locke Faircloth. He had a few other key assets as well. There was his youth, there were his good looks, and there was a secret asset that would be the linchpin for his entire career. In June of 1993, 9-year-old Valerie went swimming with her father at the Medfield Area Recreation Club in Cary, North Carolina. What neither of them knew was that this seemingly enjoyable day at the pool would end in tragedy. When Natalie walked into the wading pool, she, waded a bit. At one point, she casually sat down in the shallow water, maybe to relax, maybe to take in the sights. But Natalie didn't sit down on the pool floor. She accidentally sat right on top of the pool drain. And unbeknownst to her, the drain cover in that wading pool had been removed by someone, and Valerie sat down square on the opening. And when she did, it was a disaster. Natalie's bottom was pulled right into the drain, and the suction was so strong that she couldn't pull herself out. Natalie shrieked, and that wasn't just out of fear. She was also in immense pain. The pressure from the drain suction was incredible. It was pulling her straight down, and she was being injured. 4 adults tried to pull her loose, and after an incredible struggle, she was freed. But the damage was done. The suction on her bottom was so great that about 80% of Valerie's intestines were pulled out of her body. The injuries were so devastating that Valerie must now be fed intravenously for about 12 hours a day. Valerie's family sued the pool manufacturer. The pool company initially offered $100,000 to settle the case, but Valerie's lawyer wasn't biting, and there was good reason to pass on that offer. When their lawyer looked into the matter, he learned that the pool manufacturer apparently knew of at least a dozen cases where people had become trapped or injured on pool drains. Valerie's family decided to try the case, and after 4 years of litigation, they were awarded $25 million, the largest products liability verdict in North Carolina history. Valerie's lawyer was a local attorney named John Edwards. The son of a mill worker, John Edwards grew up in North Carolina, and he was the first person in his family to go to college. After he graduated law school, he would eventually open up an office where he became known as a masterful trial attorney. He got famous after winning a $23 million judgment on behalf of the parents of a baby who suffered severe brain damage by oxygen deprivation during labor. At the time, it was the highest medical malpractice verdict in state history. Edwards was known for using every asset at his disposal to win. He was an outstanding speaker. He was able to make personal connections with juries, and he understood how to use drama in the courtroom. Once, he channeled the voice of an unborn baby to make a point. Edwards acquired legendary status during the trial on behalf of Valerie against that pool manufacturer. He was exhibiting such amazing talent that when he made the closing arguments for the case, a crowd gathered to watch. One reporter called his closing statement, quote, "the most impressive legal performance I have ever seen." John Edwards was a legal rock star. His multi-million-dollar wins made him wealthy. His performance in notching those wins made him locally famous. His clients loved him, the press loved him, and his wife loved him. Elizabeth Edwards was born Mary Elizabeth Anania in Jacksonville, Florida. Her father was a Navy pilot, and in her early years she attended school in Japan. She met her future husband when they were both law students at the University of North Carolina. On their first date, they went dancing at a local Holiday Inn. At the end of that date, John kissed Elizabeth on the forehead, and she once said that it was just really sweet. They got married the day after they both took the bar exams in July of 1977. The couple had 4 children: Wade, Kate, Emma Claire, and Jack. Their eldest son, Wade, was killed in a car accident when he was only 16 years old. The wind got hold of his Jeep in a strange way and blew him off the road. Elizabeth Edwards nabbed a prestigious job out of law school. She clerked for a federal judge and later went on to be a bankruptcy lawyer. But it seems that her passion was in politics, or at least political causes. Elizabeth Edwards never held elected office herself, but she worked as a practicing attorney until 1996 when she left the law to devote herself to the Wade Edwards Foundation following her son's death. Her husband, John, had political aspirations of his own. When you're a handsome family man and a successful lawyer in North Carolina, there's one thing you can do to accelerate your career even more: go into politics. And that is why John Edwards ran against the incumbent pig farmer, Locke Faircloth. When her husband decided to run against Locke Faircloth for the United States Senate, Elizabeth Edwards was all in. And she might have been her husband's biggest and most valuable asset. Elizabeth emerged as a powerful behind-the-scenes force during her husband's campaign. She served as his chief policy advisor, and she advocated publicly for universal health care and other social causes. The idea of John Edwards running for Senate was, on paper, preposterous. He had never held any kind of office at any level, so the idea of jumping straight into a race for the nation's Senate was pretty much unheard of. And not only was he completely devoid of any political experience, the man hadn't even voted in some of the recent elections. But none of that mattered to John Edwards. He knew he was loaded with assets that could help him win an election against a good old boy like Locke Faircloth. And when Edwards turned his attention to the Senate campaign, he followed the same formula he used to become a great lawyer. He was energetic. He had a face made for television. His ability to speak on camera was second to none. He had charm in small groups, and he could also command a room full of strangers, and he was a whiz with a teleprompter. John Edwards ran as the anti-Locke Faircloth. Faircloth was older and just plain-looking, while Edwards was young and handsome with a beautiful family. Even though Faircloth was a first-term senator, he was cast as the establishment candidate. Edwards, on the other hand, took the fact that he never held political office and used that as an asset as well. He ran as an outsider and cast himself as a reformer. He called himself the People's Senator. And in the true spirit of using every asset available to win, Edwards put $6 million of his own money into the campaign. And there was one more thing that Edwards would acquire during his campaign. It was a contact that would be both the best and worst person he'd associate with. Andrew Young's father was a minister. And if you're the son of a minister in the South, you travel with your father a lot. You go to retreats, you go visiting other congregations, and you end up sitting through a lot of speeches. That's why Andrew Young knew when someone had a knack for public speaking, and he knew when he was in the presence of someone special. Young recalls a day in 1998 when he heard candidate John Edwards give a stump speech during his campaign against Locke Faircloth. Andrew turned to his girlfriend and said, "This man could be president." It was at that moment that Andrew made the decision that he would work for John Edwards. Young started as a junior campaign staffer who dedicated himself towards John Edwards' win, and the team he became a part of was successful. John Edwards beat Locke Faircloth. He was headed to Washington as the junior senator from North Carolina. Edwards arrived in D.C. with a heck of a team. First, there was his wife Elizabeth, a woman who was described as the adored every woman next door, worldly yet approachable, equally comfortable discussing policy or her children. Second, there was his newly promoted right-hand man. Andrew Young's job would be to take care of John Edwards and make his life easy. And Young was ready to do absolutely anything necessary to make that happen. In fact, he kissed up to the senator immensely and pretty much did anything he asked. He picked him up at the airport, he got him breakfast, he cleaned his house, he even got him his newspapers, but Edwards would make him cut out the ads before giving them to him to read. Andrew Young, however, didn't mind. He was a loyal lackey. Edwards' rise to the top of the Democratic Party was meteoric. As soon as he got to Congress, he was enlisted to use his trial skills to help President Clinton during his impeachment trial over the Monica Lewinsky fiasco. Edwards sat in on a few key depositions and did a stellar job. It earned him kudos from the Democratic Party bigwigs. In fact, they were so impressed that a year later, Edwards caught the eye of Vice President Al Gore, who put him on his short list of possible running mates. Gore ended up choosing Joe Lieberman, but Edwards' star was rising. And it wasn't just people on the Hill who were noticing John Edwards. That same year, he was named People magazine's sexiest politician alive. By 2002, John Edwards started to pursue what was surely his goal all along. He began a run for the presidency. And he did surprisingly well. In the 2004 primary, Edwards came in second in Iowa with 32% and won the primary in South Carolina. But John Kerry dominated the famous Super Tuesday primaries, and Edwards dropped out. But his success earned him a place on the John Kerry ticket because Kerry selected Edwards as his vice presidential running mate. Unfortunately for the pair, they lost to incumbent President George W. Bush. As John Edwards licked his wounds on Election Day, he did not know that the loss of the presidency would not be the most devastating blow he would suffer that week. The day after Election Day, John's wife Elizabeth revealed to him that she had breast cancer. That may have been a shock to John, but not to Elizabeth. Elizabeth knew before the election that she might have cancer, but she kept it from her husband during the final stretch of the campaign. With the campaign now over, however, John Edwards had a choice to make. His Senate term was expiring. Should he run for re-election? Edwards chose not to do so. He would leave the Senate after only one term. The question, of course, is why? One reason for that choice has a sort of altruistic angle. His wife was struggling with breast cancer. There would surely be surgery and treatment in the near future, so it's possible that he wanted to be by his wife's side during that struggle. That's certainly one possible explanation. I'm not so sure, however, that it's the best explanation. Maybe it's the Jersey in me that makes me a cynic. It could be. But I think the more plausible explanation for why John Edwards didn't run for re-election to the Senate is because he never really wanted to be a senator. John Edwards wanted to be president. That's why he didn't bother to run for some local office before taking on Locke Faircloth for the United States Senate. He wanted to shoot straight up to the big time. For John Edwards, Senate was also just a stepping stone towards the presidency. And in the last election, he tasted it. He was so close. Going back to the Senate at that point would have been probably a step backwards for him. So, instead of moving in what he probably thought was the wrong direction, John Edwards left the Senate when his term expired. He took a job working for a nonprofit, and he bided his time. 4 more years, and he could run again. Over the next 2 years, John Edwards was in a holding pattern. He stood by his wife's side when she had surgery and then radiation therapy, and the two celebrated when she was pronounced cured of breast cancer. But the two were also plotting John Edwards' return to politics. And I do believe they were doing it together. John and Elizabeth Edwards weren't just a married couple, they were a power couple. She was a successful lawyer. She pursued her own important political agenda behind the scenes. She probably wanted her husband to become president as much as he did. While John Edwards was in a holding pattern waiting for the next election cycle to come up, Elizabeth was working. She became a major political figure in her own right. She wrote a best-selling book. She was attracting big crowds on the lecture circuit, and together she and John were shaping his platform. So when the time was right, John Edwards re-engaged in the run for the presidency, along with Elizabeth, who had now become his greatest asset. The two fought cancer together, they built a platform together, and now they were going to go on the campaign together. And when they looked at the field of candidates during that campaign, they must have thought that the political gods were smiling down upon them. The field of Democratic candidates for that presidential election was terrible. Hillary Clinton, once considered a shoo-in for the nomination, was struggling mightily. The seeming inevitability of her candidacy was plagued by infighting among her advisors and strategic missteps made by her campaign. In short, she was vulnerable in the primary. As for the other challenger, Barack Obama, he was a first-term senator who was considered too green for the presidency. John Edwards, on the other hand, was positioned perfectly. When the calendar flipped and 2006 began, John and Elizabeth Edwards were preparing for the election. The announcement of his candidacy wouldn't come till the end of that year, which meant that 2006 was all about laying the groundwork. Edwards built a pre-campaign team which surely included his right-hand man, Andrew Young. Team member Elizabeth Edwards was doing her part by writing books and going on speaking engagements, and the soon-to-be candidate was taking meetings and getting all of his assets lined up. Part of those assets were financial, and in that regard, he got pretty lucky. Did you ever hear of Carnegie Mellon University? Carnegie Mellon University. Well, the son of Mellon from Carnegie Mellon, the son of the Mellon from Carnegie Mellon University, was a well-known art dealer, philanthropist, and generally just kind of a rich guy, you know? When he passed away, his wife basically got all his money, and Bunny Mellon carried on in her husband's footsteps. Bunny was a stereotypical wealthy socialite, and she liked to dabble in politics. Bunny Mellon, at 100 years old, saw John Edwards on TV and was drawn to him. She said that he reminded her of John F. Kennedy. She simply needed to meet him, and she wanted to support him. But how? The way Bunny Mellon was introduced to John Edwards is important for the story. The problem is it forces me to throw out a bunch of names, and my wife always tells me that the quickest way to lose an audience is to throw out too many names. My friend Mark sent me a message the other day saying the same thing. So I'm going to explain this with as few names as possible, but even then it might get a little messy. But later you're going to see why I kept this in. Some years back, 100-year-old Bunny Mellon met a 40-year-old interior designer named Brian Huffman. Huffman once complimented the heiress on some beautiful church windows she endowed, and that began a long friendship. Brian Huffman was originally from North Carolina, and his sister was a law school classmate of John Edwards' right-hand man, Andrew Young. Did you get that? Heiress Bunny Mellon is friends with interior designer Brian Huffman. Brian Huffman's sister went to law school with Andrew Young. Andrew Young is the assistant to John Edwards. That is how Bunny Mellon ended up connected with John Edwards. Edwards was probably ecstatic. He was about to embark upon a presidential campaign, and presidential campaigns need money, which comes from donors. Wealthy old socialites with money to burn are the perfect kind of donors. So John Edwards met Bunny Mellon at her Virginia estate in 2006. Bunny came through almost immediately. About a month after their meeting, she sponsored a Manhattan fundraiser that brought in about $85,000 for Edwards' campaign. She ultimately donated about $3.5 million to his PAC, the Alliance for a New America. 2006 was shaping up for John Edwards. In February of 2006, Rielle Hunter was in the Hyatt Regency in New York City. She was sitting with a friend when a gorgeous man walked through the lobby. Riel could not take her eyes off of him. And what made it even more enticing is that the man couldn't stop staring back. The man sat down and conducted some business with a couple of other people, but that business probably became of secondary importance to him because he couldn't take his eyes off Riel. After the man's conversation was over, he got up to leave, but he and Riel met eyes once again for what was far too long to be considered a parting glance. Riel's friend saw the whole thing unfold, and after the man left, the friend approached the group that remained. She asked one of them, "Was that John Edwards?" Indeed it was. Edwards was in town conducting some important pre-campaign meetings. Riel got up and joined her friend in the conversation. She said, "I can't believe that was John Edwards. He's so hot." Edwards' business associate said, "You should have come over and told him that. He would have loved to hear that." Alas, Riel seemed to have missed her shot to connect with the man that she saw from across the room, a man with whom she had a brief but meaningful staring session, a man who she believed she established a real connection with. Riel and her friend walked out of the hotel to go get dinner, and lo and behold, John Edwards walked around the corner. Riel remembers John's face lighting up. She said he was so excited. I mean, he just lit up like a Christmas tree. White lights, just bright as can be. I just turned to him and I said, "You're so hot." And he practically jumped into my arms. I said, "I can help you." Riel was a videographer, and she offered to help Edwards in his campaign. She said, "I could help you be more of your authentic self, so people could see who you really are." Edwards replied, "I want your help. I need your help." The two decided to discuss it further in John's hotel room. Riel spent the night. Riel said that the next day the two spent the entire day together. They were talking all day long. Edwards confided in her that his marriage to Elizabeth was plagued with problems and that it had been that way for years. Riel almost immediately fell in love with John Edwards. Riel joined the campaign as a videographer, and the connection between her and John deepened. It was tough, though, for them to speak, without getting caught, so Riel bought John a cell phone. The cell phone she purchased was identical to his work phone. That way, when the two of them would speak, people would just think that John was on a work call. The couple maintained their relationship for the entire year. At the end of that year, on December 28, 2006, John Edwards announced that he was running for president. But what should have been the beginning of the greatest journey of his life turned into a nightmare. 3 days later, on New Year's Eve, his wife Elizabeth found the other cell phone. Elizabeth must have been confused when she found an identical other phone. She must have searched through the prior calls and found the one number that was dialed the most, so she dialed it. Riel's phone rang. She looked down on it and saw the caller ID. She answered the phone and said, "Hey, baby." Elizabeth immediately hung up. There must have been a cascade of emotions going through Elizabeth Edwards' mind at that moment. Betrayal, sadness, you name it, and they were all probably flooding her brain at the same time. It seems, however, that anger led the way. Elizabeth apparently confronted her husband because a short while later Riel's phone rang again. Only this time, it was John. He said very matter-of-factly, "We're done. We're over." And then he hung up the phone. Riel cried for days. The cat was out of the bag, and Elizabeth now knew about the affair. She knew that her husband was on the verge of jeopardizing everything the couple had worked for. She surely knew that if the affair was leaked, that it would doom the campaign. But John assured her that it was over. So she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to continue to fight and push forward. What she didn't know, however, is that her husband had absolutely no intention of actually ending things with Riel Hunter. While Elizabeth and John got down to the business of campaigning, they quickly lost focus again. 3 months after announcing his candidacy, Elizabeth's cancer returned. And this time it was bad. The couple held a news conference where they announced that Elizabeth's cancer had recurred, and while it was treatable, it was considered incurable. But Elizabeth stood strong. She said that even though the doctors told her that the prognosis was uncertain, they were pushing on with the campaign. She showed a stiff upper lip. She said, quote, "Is this a hardship for us? Yes, it's another hurdle. But I've seen people who are in real desperate shape who don't have the wonderful support I have. And it's unbelievably important that we get this election right." 2 months later, Rielle Hunter got pregnant with John Edwards' baby. Edwards had to figure out how he was going to deal with this. It was not a good look for a presidential candidate to have a mistress and an illegitimate love child. That was not a prescription for election success. So Edward needed a plan. He didn't know what he would do, but he knew that dropping out of the race would not be part of that plan. Lucky for John Edwards, there was another woman who was smitten with the politician. John Edwards and his right-hand man, Andrew Young, devised a scheme to keep Rielle Hunter's pregnancy a secret. Andrew and his wife would go into hiding with Rielle. They'd stay at hotels and private homes, they'd move from place to place, and they'd keep clear of the media until Rielle gave birth. What would they do after she gave birth? Who knows? Maybe they thought that after he won the election, they could reveal the baby and he could fall on his sword, but by then he'd already be president. I don't know. Or maybe they didn't even think that far ahead. Regardless, that's what they did. Rielle moved in with Andrew and his wife, and they hid her from the press. There was, however, one tiny problem. All of that cost money. John Edwards was wealthy, but he couldn't fund it. The trail would lead right back to him. That is when the crew called Bunny. Andrew Young called Bunny Mellon and told her that John Edwards had an urgent personal need for some money. Apparently, Young did not reveal that the personal need was the need to hide a sex partner and love child from the press. Bunny didn't know any of that, and she was happy to help. But the payments couldn't just be made to Edwards because, again, people could trace it. So Young had Bunny write bank checks for, quote, furniture. Those checks were made out to Brian Huffman's North Carolina-based interior design business. Now you see why I gave you those names before? Yeah, the checks were written from Bunny. They were made out to allegedly purchase furniture, and they were paid to Brian Huffman's business. Then Huffman endorsed those checks over to Young, who gave the money to Edwards. Mellon started to provide the checks in June of 2007. Young and Edwards called it the Bunny money. That Bunny money ended up totaling over $725,000. Meanwhile, Bunny didn't suspect anything to be wrong and had no idea what she was funding. 1 month later, John and Elizabeth Edwards announced that they would be renewing their wedding vows. Only a politician could have the chutzpah to do something like that, am I right? Incredible. The campaign went on. Rielle Hunter's belly grew, and Andrew Young and his wife were trying to keep her hidden. And it was working out fine. Until they found out. Who are they? They are the ones who eventually find out all of the dirt on everyone. In December of 2007, the National Enquirer snapped a photo of Rielle Hunter. She was 7 months pregnant. The Enquirer ran a story that Edwards was having an affair with a former campaign staffer. John Edwards denied it all. He told reporters, quote, "The story is false. It's completely untrue. Ridiculous. I've been in love with the same woman for 30 plus years, and as anybody who's been around us knows, she's an extraordinary human being. Warm, loving, beautiful, sexy, and as good a person as I've ever known." John Edwards was furious. He called Rielle and screamed at her. Things were falling apart. They had to do something. If this came out, it would doom his campaign. So Edwards, Rielle, and Andrew Young came up with an idea. Rielle says it was Andrew's idea. Andrew says it was Edward's idea. The truth is, it doesn't matter. Whoever had the idea is irrelevant. What's relevant is that they all thought it was a good idea, and the idea was for Andrew Young to say that he was the father.
You are the father!
When the press confronted John Edwards, he publicly denied that the child was his, and they all went with the story that the baby belonged to Andrew Young. Edwards' personal life was in turmoil. His campaign, however, was the opposite. A little excitement there would have been nice. The problem was, no one was getting excited about the Edwards candidacy. In January of 2008, he withdrew from the presidential race. Barack Obama would eventually get the nomination. The next month, Rielle Hunter gave birth to a little girl. She was still living with Andrew Young and his wife. And then John Edwards ghosted all of them. Andrew Young said Edwards simply stopped taking his calls once he dropped out of the race. Now, the rest of this story here is Andrew Young's position. It seems that John Edwards denies a bunch of this, so I'll just say this is all alleged. Andrew Young says that Edwards ghosted him for months. When June of 2008 came, Rielle was still living at his house. Young was furious because, well, why wouldn't he be? He was living with John Edwards' mistress and her infant, and Edwards was making it seem like none of them existed. On June 18th, Andrew finally got a meeting with Edwards, and they had it out. The men met in a hotel room near Washington, D.C., and the meeting was intense. Andrew Young was shouting. He wanted Edwards to come clean. Edwards, however, wanted everything to be kept quiet still. Why? Because Edwards thought there was still a chance that he could be asked to be Barack Obama's vice presidential running mate. He was in the middle of negotiating with the Obama team, so he wanted to continue to hide his mistress and love child to see how that all played out. A month later, Edwards' political life imploded when a photographer got a picture of him meeting with Rielle and their baby at the Beverly Hills Hilton. It seems like this was the first time he met the baby, whose name is Quinn. She was 5 months old. But when the press asked him about this, he still didn't come clean. In an interview with ABC News, Edwards fessed up about the affair, but he said that he was not the baby's father. At the time that interview aired, Andrew Young happened to be on a cruise in Alaska, and when he saw that interview, he almost threw himself off the boat. He flew off the handle. He demanded to have another face-to-face meeting with Edwards. Andrew's story of that next meeting with Edwards in August is incredible. It was reported by WCNC, a North Carolina TV station. Apparently, Young said that he was asked to wait in his car near John Edwards' home. Edwards pulled up in a borrowed black Suburban and waved for Young to follow him. Young says that he followed Edwards as the politician drove erratically down winding rural roads. He led Young to a secluded spot, and when they stopped at the dead end of that road, Young was terrified. Edwards told Young to get in his car, which he did reluctantly. Edwards nervously talked about the money that Bunny Mellon had given him, and to Andrew's shock, Edwards claimed that he didn't know anything about it. And that's when Andrew Young thought he was being set up. He thought maybe he was being recorded. So to protect himself, Andrew Young said he also had no idea that those checks existed. The two got into a heated discussion, which ended when Andrew told Edwards that he had all the evidence he needed to sink the politician and that he was going to go public with it all. Edwards ended the conversation by saying, quote, "You can't hurt me, Andrew. You can't hurt me." John Edwards might have been suffering bad publicity, but his problems were about to get worse. The day after the ABC News interview aired, where he denied being Quinn's father, government prosecutors all met to discuss opening up an investigation. They were concerned that campaign money was used illegally. Representatives from the United States Attorney's Office, the IRS, and the Department of Justice all met and decided to look into things. They reviewed the transactions made by Andrew Young. Apparently, the banks that he was depositing the Bunny money into thought that something was off, so they filed documents called suspicious activity reports. Investigators found those suspicious activity reports, and they wondered whether the money was being used to keep the whole Riel Hunter affair quiet. If it was, it might be a campaign finance violation. Investigators then unraveled the web and found the checks written to the interior decorator, Brian Huffman. When they questioned him about it, Huffman didn't have an explanation. Still, they didn't quite have anything on John Edwards. The investigation was hampered somewhat, too, because there was a presidential election going on, and John Edwards was in the thick of that election. They were worried that if the investigation went public, they could be accused of trying to affect the outcome of an election. So they tried to keep things low. In November of 2008, only a few days after Barack Obama was elected, federal investigators got wind that Andrew Young was building a big house in North Carolina. It was only partly finished, but they believed that someone was living in there. They went down there, knocked on the door, but no one answered. And then they yelled, "Andrew Young, this is the FBI, and we need to talk to you." Andrew then came to the door. And what did he say? He seemed relieved. He said, "I'm glad it was you. I thought it was the press." After their conversation with Andrew Young, the investigation picked up steam. In August of 2009, a grand jury was convened. Riel Hunter testified. 5 months later, in January of 2010, John Edwards finally admitted that he was the baby's father. What prompted him to come clean? Maybe it was a change of heart. Maybe it was a moment of conscience. Nope. Andrew Young wrote a tell-all book, and Edwards knew he was cooked. It seems that he told the truth because he could no longer plausibly deny it, and he wanted to get it out there before the book was published. That was apparently the last straw for his wife, Elizabeth. A week later, the couple separated. John Edwards fought the investigation for the next year. All the while, Elizabeth was fighting for her life. In December of 2010, she succumbed to cancer and passed away. 6 months later, John Edwards was indicted on counts including conspiracy, illegal campaign contributions, and making false statements. The government alleged that he conducted an illegal conspiracy to support Riel Hunter during the 2008 Democratic primary campaign for president. The case went to trial. After a 9-day trial, he was found not guilty of illegally taking that bunny money. But that was only one count. The jury couldn't make a decision on the other 5. They were deadlocked, and the judge declared a mistrial. ABC News reported that Edward gave an emotional speech on the courthouse steps right after the verdict was released. He acknowledged his moral shortcomings and thanked his children. And when it came to his newest child, the baby he had with Mistress Riel Hunter, Edward said, quote, "My precious Quinn, who I love more than any of you can ever imagine, who I'm so close to, so grateful for. No one else is responsible for my sins. I am responsible." Edwards said that he didn't believe he did anything illegal, but acknowledged that the affair he conducted while his wife Elizabeth was dying of cancer was awful and wrong. When there's a mistrial, the prosecution has the ability to refile the charges and try the defendant again. In this case, they didn't do that. No charges were refiled, and John Edwards walked free. And for reasons I can't explain, he also didn't face any attorney disciplinary charges. Today, John Edwards is, once again, practicing law in North Carolina. An incredible story, don't you think? It's amazing what some politicians will do. I get a lot of emails regarding the podcast, and I really appreciate getting all of them. But one of the most common ones I get says, "Why don't you talk about the Trump lawyers?" So I've already talked about Michael Cohen, and I've already talked about Rudy Giuliani, and I'm happy to talk about some others, but I'd like your input on which ones I should talk about. Not just generically, but which ones in particular. And remember that the lawyers I cover here are ones who have either been actually charged or convicted or disciplined. So if you'd like to recommend someone, and quite frankly, if you'd like to recommend any lawyer for any story, you can go to our website, goodlawyersgonebad.com, go to the Contact Us page, and send me a note through that Contact Us page. It comes right to my email. Thanks so much for listening, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.